New York Public Radio? Okay. Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah. Oh, that's so interesting. Years ago, when I went to American Public Radio internal conference, actually, I was acting as a consultant. But they decided that they felt that it was not ethical to.
All right, good afternoon. Welcome back from the break, and we'll start with our next panel on big data and climate adaptation technologies, and hopefully we'll have discussions which were touched upon by the previous panels on data to knowledge to decision making, and more importantly, informed decision making, how we can start to pull data together from a variety of sources, and that impacts decision making from various sectors' perspective. And from an ND Gain is the world's leading index today, showing which countries are best prepared to deal with global changes brought about by overcrowding, resource constraints, and climate disruption. And it does that by looking at data going back over 15 years, and ranks countries, or 170 countries, based on different dimensions and how vulnerable they are to droughts, superstorms, and other natural disasters, and uniquely how ready they are to successfully implement adaptation solutions. So if you think about it from that perspective, going back 15 years of data, identifying factors of vulnerability, and then figuring out how ready they are for investment decisions, we are charting the path from data to knowledge to decision making. It sort of is the pipeline. So one thing I'd like to begin the panel with quoting a famous economist, and let me get my notes out.
You can make it up.
I'm going to make it up, and I've known Ray for several years, so he knows how I play it. So, in the economist Hayek, who shared the Nobel Memorial Prize in Economic Sciences for pioneering work in the theory of money and economic fluctuations, and penetrating analysis of the independence of economic, social, and institutional phenomena. Now, he frames his essay, and I quote from his essay, in the economic process and economic planning, but remove the word economics wherever I use that, and think of it from your favorite sector. Think of it how ND Gain can be helpful, whether it's in infrastructure or agriculture or food or security, and it sort of adheres to what he's trying to say. So I begin. In ordinary language, we describe by the word planning the complex of interrelated decisions about the allocation of our available resources. All economic activity is in this sense planning, and in any society in which many people collaborate, this planning, whoever does it, will in some measure have to be based on knowledge, which in the first instance is not given to the planner, but to somebody else. That's very important. All the knowledge, all the data that even we think about it from an ND Gain perspective is sitting in different silos, is different in different sectors, governed by different organizations, but yet all that information is pulled together and given to a planner who acts on that. The various ways in which the knowledge on which people base their plans is communicated to them is a crucial problem for any theory explaining the economic process. And the problem of what is the best way of utilizing knowledge, initially dispersed among all the people, is at least one of the main problems of economic policy or of designing an efficient economic system. And it's a very powerful statement from that perspective, that how do we really leverage all the collective knowledge together to build an efficient system? And whatever responsive efficient system is going to go after. So we have a esteemed set of panelists who have some questions, and hopefully they can respond to this as well. We'll start with Amy Lowes, who is the Climate Change Director, Skoll Global Threats Fund. And her work has focused on water and climate work, relying on data governance and public engagement in relation to global threats, enhancing access to information on water and climate resource globally, innovation in big data, and resilience in her previous work with Google. So Amy, please.
Thank you. And thank you to Joyce, if she's here, for the invitation to participate in this panel. So I wanted to start off in my opening few words to say a few words about the historical challenges of using indices in decision-making, indices in general, but also indices in particular around climate change, vulnerability, and adaptive capacity, indicators like the gain index, which is a very strong indicator but has its limitations, as so many do. And then I want to turn to the opportunities and risks that the era of big data presents for overcoming some of these challenges. So again, let me start off in saying that I'm generally very wary of generic indices, and indices which attempt to characterize complex system in one number or in a couple of numbers. And we're often, I'm sure we're all familiar with the phrase that a picture is worth 1,000 words, but I would say a word of caution: a number is not worth 1,000 words. And how indicators are interpreted, however, often suggests that they are. So, and if they're used in the wrong way, they can lead to bad decisions and often lead to more harm than good. So the classic example of a single indicator representing a complex system is GDP. So GDP is our single metric in the society of progress. And of course, this then creates incentives and prioritizes market-based products, goods, versus non-market-based goods, such as clean air, water, climate, for example. Now, GDP is a very important metric, but once it's placed into a decision-making process, it creates incentives and priorities that are not necessarily supportive of the general progress and values of the society. Another example, which is much more central to my world in terms of global climate change, is global average surface temperature. So global average surface temperature is the indicator that climate scientists and now the global society use as a measure of how we're doing in terms of the global climate crisis, moving closer to levels of danger and the level at which we are affecting the global climate. Now, global average climate change, global average temperature, however, doesn't really mean anything. It's not really a number. No one ever feels the global average temperature. But it's a really useful number, right? It's a useful number because it's the one characteristic about the climate that we have a lot of data about. So we can measure it as accurately as possible. So it is useful. But when you get it into a decision-making ecosystem and it is focused on as the sole metric, then it creates, it can be distracting and blind us really to the true problem that we're trying to address. So there are obviously lots of challenges, but that doesn't mean there's not a role for them. Moving to the gain index, for example, we have measures of at a national level, and this can be very valuable for awareness building. But decision-making processes, it can be misleading. So take, for example, the readiness value and the vulnerability values. If you look at across the nation, the world, the US, of course, becomes very, very green. And that's appropriate if you're looking at the awareness value to look at the globe. On the other hand, it completely blinds you to the fact that a place like New Orleans is incredibly vulnerable. Now, this isn't a surprise, but when it becomes operational versus to support decision-making versus just awareness building, it really, certain people in these countries are not apparent. So part of the reason, how do we get to this place? Part of the challenge is that characterizing complex systems is complicated. So it's hard to do. We like numbers, so we land on them. But part of the problem also is oftentimes we've been limited by data. And so now in walks the era of big data. And how can, many questions arise in terms of, does big data really provide an opportunity to overcome some of these challenges? And I would say yes, it does. It provides the opportunity to shift from the single index characterization of a nation, of a sector, to looking more uniquely at a region. Instead of characterizing an indicator and placing it on a country or on a sector, looking at the sector and saying, what is it about that sector that makes it vulnerable? Vulnerable of what to what? So you can imagine sort of taking the analytical approaches of Google or a Facebook that have used their analytical approaches to look at individualizing, personalizing the advertisements that they that we see every day on the internet, and using those same analytical approaches to transforming how we do vulnerability and adaptive capacity indicators. Now, however, as I say this, I also want to be sure that we need to be careful to balance the desire to measure as the goal, measure and monitor vulnerability and resilience, or adaptive capacity, to building adaptive capacity or reducing resilience. So in this context, I'm reminded of the observer effect, the principle that we all learn in physics, that when you observe something, you can't observe something without influencing it. And when you get down into such a detailed level of monitoring, which we can now do in the sort of world of big data, being able to analyze so many things, we do get to a much closer level where we do influence it. Now, when it comes to managing climate risks, if we're observing and monitoring climate vulnerability, and in the process we are actually reducing vulnerability, our influence on that system by observing it is actually reducing vulnerability, then that's a good thing, that's a win-win. But we have to worry about when those times when we're observing the system, we're actually creating more vulnerabilities or reducing adaptive capacity. So what I'm getting at here is human agency. You can monitor a system and take away human agency, take away control of humans' lives. This came up earlier in one session I was in earlier today, where when people, research shows that when communities have control over their lives, have control over their communities, they are more resilient. They're more resilient to stresses. So what I'd love to see in the context of where gain index leads and vulnerability and capacity indicators more generally is, can we begin to build the systems that use the power of the big data world, but in a way that empowers human agency and allows us to own the data and own the information and help be creators of the information in a way that not only monitors and tracks vulnerability and adaptive capacity, but also builds adaptive capacity and reduces resilience. Thank you.
Thank you, Amy. And I'll turn it over to Cynthia, who's the CEO and co-founder of CSRHub and partner and co-founder of ECOS International. She's been an early participant in the sustainability movement to help corporations understand sustainability. And her works involve complex company measurement, reporting, and transparency in sustainability practices. And she's also been involved in evaluating and rating the performance of companies from publicly traded to privately held in the environment. And she has a few slides to share with us today.
Thank you. Thanks so much, and I am delighted and honored to participate in this conversation, and it's wonderful to link big data to our hope for change, especially in this season of hope and expectancy. With ECOS International, I've been really in this sustainability movement for nearly 20 years, helping large corporations integrate sustainability into their core business strategies and operation. And working with companies like Boeing, BNSF, Coca-Cola, and others, we did quite a bit of internal work to benchmark, and always kind of struggled, had developed a somewhat proprietary system to do that as a consultant, but struggled to look for sources and data and really understand how do you help companies understand how they're doing relative to their competitors, their peers, and best in class. I then, about 6 years ago, co-founded CSRHub and began to work on this, grapple with this issue of how to rate corporate social responsibility and sustainability of companies worldwide. And if we could get this information, how would it influence us? Today, we're actually a big data platform, and we're an aggregator of sources. And with nearly 40 million data elements, we're now a very comprehensive tool to do benchmarking. I'm now a little bit worried, though, that a number does not tell 1,000 words. But we'll get into it a little bit. We're covering 8,400 companies in 104 countries, and we're doing this to hopefully improve performance. I mean, that is really the goal, is to shine a bright light on corporate performance and to really make more transparent the data that is out there. Really, here is a snapshot comparing Coca-Cola to Pepsi. At first, I thought maybe this wasn't a very appropriate comparison. They're really struggling with, I think, issues of now in the perception of obesity and other, I think, nutrition issues. But obviously, they have a footprint issue, and water being their most important footprint challenge. And there's a lot of data on these two companies for 120 sources that we have uncovered that cover their environment, social, and governance performance. However, there are gaps in the data as well. Only 49 of those sources rate both companies. And there's complexity because at least 70 of the major beverage companies are scattered across 27 countries. So, there's just a huge challenge of both collecting the data and then making sense of it. Today, CSRHub rates 12 indicators of employee, environment, community, and governance performance, and we also flag many special issues, such as it took us several months to just identify what companies are involved in fracking, what companies are doing business in Burma, what companies are in nuclear, or what companies have good high number of women on the board, et cetera. And so what we have created now is a way to analyze and compare using 290 sources, 10 of which we license from primarily investor-facing analysts. These are known as ESG sources, but we also look at indexes, publications, best and worst of lists, NGO, crowdsources, and government agencies. These ratings are updated monthly, and we are continually ingesting new sources, including crowd-based sources, and hope to eventually rate hundreds of thousands of companies worldwide. So one of the questions that we had was, what is the correlation between a company's performance and its headquartered, where it's headquartered? And in an initial review of this relationship, we correlated our average overall score of companies in our database with the 104 countries that we cover in the GAIN index. We found a 15% correlation. That's not thrilling, but on the other hand, I think the analysis is very preliminary, and I think it's also potentially misleading. If you think about in our system, first of all, it's dangerous because the overall score is really a composite of the 4 dimensions, which are not highly correlated within a company often. So a company might be leading in their environmental activities and lagging in how they treat their employees, or in human rights and supply chain, or product. I mean, so it's very difficult to give an overall number of how a company is actually performing, although we do give an overall number. So then I think there is that issue. There's also the issue that you're averaging a great number of companies within a country. And so, for example, in the United States, we cover 2,500 companies, but in China, we only have 134 companies, mostly because of the lack of data. Well, the data is probably out there. It's just tough to get. And then I think furthermore, there's the challenge of expanding the boundary of analysis because, of course, much of what's happening in this whole movement of big data is to really understand what's happening beyond scope 1 and 2, and it's moving out into looking at the supply chain performance and collecting that data, most of which is really private and difficult to get your hands on. So this kind of correlation work is exciting. I think it's interesting, and it's just the tip of the iceberg. I think we can also use data as pressure when we're looking at corporate performance. Recently, there was an article by Suzanne Goldenberg in The Guardian talking about 90 companies causing 2/3 of man-made global warming. But I think we can go deeper, and we can say, as we shine a brighter light on these companies, how are they performing relative to one another? For example, I flew here on Alaska Air, and Brad Tilden, their CEO, was sitting across the aisle from me, and Coach, I might add, and he said he always flies Coach, and they score very high in the CSRHub rating system. I think they're actually our highest scoring airline, and they've made significant progress in investing in an efficient fleet and improving their navigation technology and doing many other things. Key factors in reducing their carbon emissions by 30% since 2004. So I think some of the challenges that we have in big data is just that it's gated often by voluntary reporting to important institutions. Now, there's the analysts who are rating companies regardless of whether they want to be rated. They're going out and they're covering them, and they're using data that the company has put into the made public through their CSR report and in other ways. But then there's also a voluntary participation in things like the Global Reporting Initiative, the UN Global Compact, and CDP, which was Carbon Disclosure Project. And here we can see in this chart that the U.S. significantly lags other developed countries, which is obviously disturbing. And this doesn't even compare to the developing world. We know that data disclosure can propel change. CDP has been pushing the boundary and pressuring for many years now because of the investor community. In 2012, 722 institutional investors controlling $71 trillion in assets continued to put pressure on companies to report, and now 81% of the Global 500 and 4,000 companies worldwide are formally disclosing. And this most recent survey included a question on whether or not the company sets an internal carbon price and what it was. And so many said yes and didn't disclose, but I guess 30 plus companies said that they do have an internal price, including, this was startling, many energy companies, and that they're using it for planning purposes. And the quote was, "These forward-thinking companies are preparing for the eventuality that someday in the future they will face a federal, state, or community tax or regulation meant to help combat climate change." What was interesting also is the variation in price. Whoops, I am so sorry. I've been talking away and I forgot to change the slide. So from $6 to $60. I think that in this last slide, just some implications of the work that we've been doing. Yes, there is a link between corporate sustainability, broadly defined, and country climate change adaptation. We have a lot more work to do to understand the relationship. Sustainability improvement is driven by data transparency, and corporate investment in CSR may reduce country-level vulnerability to climate change. I think CSR is a leading driver of involvement and has a strong relationship. There is a strong relationship, I think, in companies that had a strong commitment to sustainability and social equity, and are now also supporting adaptation activities. So,
Thank you, Cynthia.
yeah.
On to Raid, who I've known for over 10 years now. So Raid is at the University of Chicago, where he leads a data science fellowship program as well, which is pretty unique from the perspective of how data science can be used for social good. He's also co-founder of EdgeFlip, which is focused on data science problems for social good. And prior to that, he was the chief scientist for Obama campaign. And prior to that, he was with Accenture, managing the data analytics. So Raid, please.
Thanks. So I think what I thought I could do is sort of touch on the couple of things that both of you mentioned, and from my perspective. So I know nothing about sustainability. I am a computer scientist, so I'm basically looking for interesting problems to solve where I can make some impact. So I've got a bunch of tools and I've got these skills and I want to use them. And the challenge I personally struggle with is there are a lot of other people like me out there who have interesting skills that happen to be in high demand right now, where everybody's talking about big data, whatever that means. If you use that word, you probably don't know what it means, but that's okay. We'll use that, right? So it's a marketing term, and there's a lot of other people who are out there, and they don't quite know how to use those skills to solve the kinds of problems you've been talking about all day, because one, they're not here, and nobody here goes over there to tell them what the interesting problems are. So over here, people will talk about, well, we have all the data and we have no actionable information. Okay, well, have you ever talked to somebody who can help you create actionable information? Probably not. And so the summer program so I kind of got frustrated with this world of, there are people with interesting problems that have large social impact, and then people with skills, and there's nothing combining the two. So people like me, what do? They go to Facebook, they go to Google, LinkedIn, Twitter, Foursquare, pick your favorite internet company or finance company, hedge funds. And that's where people like me go. So if you go to conferences in computer science or anything to do with data, you'll see, more than pretty much most of the talks outside academia are from one of these companies. So students hear about these problems. They get excited by, search problems, so they can rank the search result number 6 to number 4, and that's saving everybody in the world about, 2 milliseconds, and that's a huge impact in their minds. And number of seconds saved, if that was your metric, yeah, that's a pretty good metric to look at, and you could maximize, if you saved all that, think how much the world would be more productive if everybody saved 2 milliseconds every time they did a search. Except, who cares? And that's the kind of, so I decided it was time that at least somebody started making some efforts. I saw a lot of people trying to do that. And so I see the small thing I tried to do was this summer I created a summer program called Data Science for Social Good. And I got about 40 students over to the University of Chicago from around the country, computer scientists, stats people, econometrics, public policy, kind of building this group and had them over to come to Chicago. And then we spent a lot of time before the program started talking and working with nonprofits and government organizations, federal, state, local, NGOs, to create data science projects, basically data-intensive projects that had something to do with some social impact, so areas in education and health and energy and community development and disaster relief. And the goal was primarily, one, to get these students excited about these problems, because they'd never heard about these problems. And my sort of impression was when I first was talking to students about, your skills are really useful for solving all these kinds of problems, I expected the answer to be, yeah, there's no money in there, it's not sexy, it's really boring. The response instead was, didn't realize that these problems, one, had data associated with them, two, that they could actually make a difference, because in their minds, because everything they'd heard about was, again, Facebook, Google, and all these companies, that's kind of all they thought they could really make an impact on. So we spent the summer working on about 10 to 15 projects with these different organizations, and we got this 12-week project, so you can only get so much done on these things. But what was interesting was that it really opened up the scope for seeing how can you really systematically look at these problems and build both capacity in terms of people who in the future who will be working on these projects, but also tools that are required to solve these problems. So when somebody from the education world comes and says, we're struggling with this problem called undermatching, most of the people outside the education world will look at them and, huh? What are you talking about? And once they describe the problem, it makes sense. So undermatching is this problem of a lot of students today, and this is, a huge problem in the U.S., they do really well in high schools. They're really smart. They score really well in all the things you can imagine, all the SATs and ACTs, even in the 99 percentile and plus, and they don't apply to college. And they don't not apply to college because they're going to take a year off and backpack around Europe. They don't not apply to college because they don't know what colleges to apply to, or they don't know anybody else in their network who's applied to colleges or gone to college. Maybe they'll or they apply to a college that's a local community college with a 12% graduation rate. And so one of the things, we work with, this is one project, right? We work with over summers. We work with a school district in Arizona on exactly this problem of identifying which students are at most risk of this behavior, and then designing interventions that you could work with the counselors, the parents, the peers, communities to try to change that behaviors. Now that's basically, so what that opens up to is a class of problems that you can imagine, hey, everybody has a certain number of things they're at risk for, whether that's applying to college, not applying to college, whether it's childhood obesity, whether it's asthma problems, whether it's it's a lot of them are at the individual level, right? So can you start predicting risk of individuals to take certain actions that are bad for them? And that's something that the computer science and sort of the data science community is really good at. We've spent years perfecting predicting people's behaviors. We know really well how to do that. What we lack is the second piece, which is sort of what you were talking about, is we have no idea how to change their behavior. We can tell you exactly what this person's going to do. So when it's the Obama campaign, we could tell you for every person who they're going to vote for, if they're going to vote, are they persuadable? If we were just taking a computer science perspective, we would have just stopped there. Like say, we would have predicted the result and just waited there until the result happened. And that would have been fine because that's what the pollsters do, right? So we predict the result, they predict the result, and they sit there. What we needed to do was, how do we design interventions that change that behavior and move something? Because otherwise, you're just an observer who's predicting really well, can't do anything about it. And that's what, in a way, social scientists are really good at, is taking 20 people and trying to figure out, how do I change their behavior? But there's not much data involved there. It's sort of completely ignoring what I know about them, how I can look at all this data about them. It's just, these are the people, I want to change this behavior. So I think this opens, at least in a lot of social impact space, what it opens up to sort of this collaboration between computer scientists who are really, really good at taking large amounts of data and making very accurate predictions, and social scientists who are really good at taking small number of people and trying to figure out how to manipulate them and how to make them take some action that they would really like to take, but can't scale that to 1 million people. Because for the challenges we're talking about, you really need to scale it to millions and millions of people. And it can't be a human scaling it to, it can't be a one-to-one human contact. It has to be, one person needs to be able to design something that is applicable to ideally, millions, if not more. So those are the kinds of problems we're sort of tackling. The summer is one example of that. We're continuing to sort of work with some organizations, mostly healthcare and education organizations, to come up with these types of projects where we can work with them collaboratively through the University of Chicago and see if we can both start predicting risk of behavior and then also starting to design interventions that can change things at scale. Same kind of work, sort of the work I'm doing at my startup is similar, except it's more looking at sort of how do you do that in the social media world, of how do you influence people. Again, that's something came out of a lot of work we did in the Obama campaign, of how do you use social media, which is really not useful for many things, to try to influence people. And it wasn't social media influencing people, it was people influencing people, but it gives you a really good platform because people are connected in some way. Who are the right people, and who can influence whom, and how do you build sort of these networks and grow them that can use the data behind them to do the influencing. So that's kind of, overview of kind of things I'm working on. Now, the flip side I want to sort of make sure is people who are not in the data world, often they think of data as the all-powerful tool where you can solve all problems. And I think you should be very cautious before using data. It doesn't matter if it's large data or small data. Data has a lot of limitations, and I wouldn't suggest going out and relying on data without doing your homework, right? So, for example, I work a lot with the city of Chicago, and many cities have this 311 system, right? Which it's not the non-emergency phone inquiries. So people will complain about potholes and graffiti and broken windows and all sorts of problems. Now, what the city tries to do in general is that's a sensor for them, right? So they get sent data by the city, and their goal is to reduce problems. Now, the way they measure problems is these incoming phone calls. So if they didn't get any phone calls, they've solved the problem, right? So you sort of tell them, well, shut down the phone number, and now you've solved all the problems. But what they end up doing, and there was a study, I think came out a few months ago, based partially on Sandy and other things, that that there's all this data, but it's very biased data. So where do you get pothole problems where people calls from, where you don't have bigger issues to worry about? And so if you start focusing on those things and you say that's the truth, you're going to fix the problems that don't really matter, or matter less than the real problems that are happening that are not being reported. So just because there's lots of data doesn't mean that it's accurate, it gives you a right picture of the world, and that you should start basing all your decisions on whatever data you have. You still have to be smart, and you can't sort of now be completely stupid because you have data. And I mean that happens a lot, where you sort of rely so much on data that you won't take any actions unless there's data behind it, and I think that's dangerous. So you have to kind of believe that I like the hype because it makes people slightly more rational. At the same time, the hype makes them also too dependent without thinking about it. So that's kind of what I'll leave you with is data is good, but be careful.
Thank you. So before I turn over to the audience for questions, I sort of want to pick up on the theme of, data is useful, data is good, but use it carefully. But now we talked about Google, Facebook, Twitter, the social media companies, etc., wherein they have access to the volumes and volumes of data. Every second, somebody or the other is searching and leaving traces behind, etc. So there is some notion of good quality data coming into these corporations. Now, when we think about countries, when we think about, from sustainability, from adaptation, from all these data fields that go in, whether it's infrastructure question, whether it's agriculture question, whether it's health question, and you could get the answers on potholes by talking to the person over there. But here you may not be able to talk to a person in another country and get what the truth is. How can we create an open data movement, which means that a product which is created can be freely used, distributed, and shared by people, and have more reliable data source coming in, which affect decision making at various levels, and such that we can now say that the data is trending and it won't be real time, but it's more current, and it's more complete from that perspective. What challenges we foresee at the global scale? You said U.S. as a developed country is lagging behind, but what challenges do we see at a global scale then? How do we start to get that? Any thoughts?
Well, I'll say a few things. So I think that one challenge is, so you said at a global scale, so that there's a different problem that you're going to say what's a global problem, and what's a problem that is a local problem driven by a global cause, or a local problem in aggregate that's represented in lots of different places.
Absolutely.
So I think that the issue that I was trying to get at, and I think gets to this point, is that one of the challenges of having an open data, one of the opportunities of having an open data movement that enables us to actually solve solutions and not be blind to to those people who don't have a cell phone and are reporting that pothole, is to actually create community-based information data collection systems. And so that can't solve all problems. I'm not suggesting that. But if you can have systems where it's community-based development, then they're going to say what's the problem that's most important. And they're not going to say that the potholes have made them vulnerable, so there's some aggregate map that says this is the most vulnerable region because they have potholes. But rather, they're going to say what is the thing that they need to be collect data about and what is their vulnerability. Now, I realize that's easier said than done, but I think that we are at a stage where we can help shape the direction of various different technology, data science, and so forth, and indicators to go in one direction versus the other. And the one other thing that I wanted to say about what you said is, I think that it is true that there is big data generally is most often associated with the sort of social media tracking of the hyper here, the hyper local, the hyper here, the hyper now. But in the world of climate change, which I work in, big data is about big climate information, long-term data sets. And when we're thinking about sustainability and vulnerability issues, we really need to think about beyond the here and now. And so when I think about big data, I think about it in the context of really integrating those long-term data sets and with the hyper-local here and now that helps think about the vulnerability. And it's the intersection of those that is still yet to be done in an effective way, but I think has an opportunity to transform how we think about indicators of vulnerability and sensitivity and adaptive capacity and resilience, which I think is an exciting moment, but challenging.
Mm-hmm. I think there are, to increase the flow of information and access to it, so much of the interesting data that I think could be very helpful comes from employees. And so many times employees within a company, and I'm looking at this from a company-centric point of view, but many times employees have a great deal of knowledge about a company's policies, practices, and how they're actually behaving and what the leadership is like. And those, sometimes those will be revealed externally through a CSR report where a company might report on some of the engagement factors, and you might be able to access some of that data. But it's generally speaking, it's kind of tough. I think there is a wealth of information that is there. I just heard, I just actually did a guest lecture at the University of Washington's iSchool, and it sounds kind of similar to some, and it was really interesting. And we had a student from Amazon, and I said, I really hate to say this, but Amazon, I shop there a lot, so I guess my data hasn't influenced my behavior yet, but they score really low, and on a whole bunch of dimensions, and it's really distressing to me. And this student said, I work for the company, and internally we have as employees, we've been trying to apply some pressure, and we care a lot about these issues, and we want to do more, and we know the weakness. We have a really strong understanding internally of where we're doing well and where we're not. I thought that was interesting, and so we looked to things like Glassdoor or some of these more crowd-based sources for information. We looked to consumers more broadly and their understanding of products and their experience and their perception, but it's difficult to sometimes get that expert understanding as a sort of an outsider. So those are some of the things, and as I mentioned, in terms of supply chain analysis, and really there are, through social media and other platforms, supply chain issues have become more apparent, and I think there's, Apple and its supply chain issues were, I think a good case in point. But there is a huge amount of data that we have yet to, in a sense, put out there and make public, that is being collected by folks like Walmart or Home Depot or Costco, fill in the blank, and that will help us to better understand what is not just happening within the company, but across, around the world in their 100,000 companies. And of course, sharing that, making those, creating ways for companies to share that data is really compelling and important, because often those suppliers are, serving, many masters. So, so those are just two examples, I think, of important data that is not yet easy to get at, but is very rich and important to making progress, I think, along these issues.
Thank you.
I mean, I think if you think about sort of open data, and if you're looking at sort of very grassroots open data, you're sort of struggling with three problems, right? One is incentives. Why would somebody do it? And if the incentives are uneven across people, then you're going to get more data from people who have more of an incentive. They hated something, they want a refund, they'll talk about it. That causes problems down the road if you're making decisions based on that data, because you're going to overweight these people unless you know how to deal with that. So I think incentives is a huge problem. Making it available, making it open is fine, but you need to make sure you have some incentive. Two is mechanism. How are you making it easy for people to give you data? Because if it has to be conscious, explicit data collection, that doesn't really happen. You almost want to kind of do a one-time authorization approval, where from now onwards, every transaction that you do kind of goes through the system, and you have to kind of build the trust in the beginning. This is it's not, out in the wild. It's a trusted organization doing it. And it has to be a one-time thing. It can't be a repeated, every time you purchase something, scan your receipt. People do that for lots of things, where it's not scalable, right? And the third thing is, which is, again, be careful with data, right? So when you collect all this data, if you just if you just use it naively, it will just give you the wrong information. It will make you take wrong action. So open data, a lot of government, U.S. and UK are sort of the big ones, and then different cities, New York and Chicago have been really active in open data platforms, where they're putting out a ton of data about internal functions. The problem is that they've all kind of focused on the data and not on the use of the data. They're all putting out data, and nobody understands that data. Nobody understands what problems these countries and cities face that you can use this data to help solve. And so what people do is, somebody has a weekend free, they go and put it on a map. So you'll see 1 billion hackathons and apps that are this data combined with Google Maps mashup. And it's useful for not many purposes. You can't really do much with a map. You can look at it. It looks nice, good colors. And I think so the problem is that these organizations aren't going to the people who care about helping them and telling them, here are the 5 problems we're struggling with. Can you help us solve those problems? So I think there is an open data effort, but I think in addition to that, there needs to be some sort of an effort which makes people aware of, here are the problems we face. Can you help solve these problems, as opposed to visualize more data because it's out there?
Can I just respond to that?
Yes, sure.
So, yeah, I mean, I think that the problems with big data are the same problems we just have with science, right? I mean, there's this meme out there that theory is dead. It's not. The reality is, you have to ask a question of the data, and whether it's big data or the generic indicator, the idea of, here's an index, let's put it on a people, let's put it on a sector, let's put it on, and assume that characterizes that, isn't as effective as saying, what is it about that system that makes it vulnerable, that makes it that? And from my perspective, but I'm not a data scientist, but I've worked very closely with many of them, what I see as slightly different is, yes, data science is not necessarily, it's finding pattern in data rather than asking questions and seeking the data, so there's a difference. But it is saying, what is it that we can say about a population to characterize the population, rather than what can we characterize and then what does it say about that population? In other words, it is that flip. Maybe that wasn't very clear, but it is that flip, which is what I think we need to do with indicators of vulnerability and adaptation.
Yeah, I mean that's the problem. I think one of the things I'm fairly skeptical of many indicators is, how do you know it's correct?
Yeah. Exactly.
You just made it up.
Yeah.
You asserted that this is it. And,
Yeah,
and
exactly.
if you sort of made it so that it's correct because it predicts this X number of years from now, or when people take action X in 2 years, it will change this by 10%. I think the indicator has to be, you have to add that extra piece to sort of say, well, it will be correct if this happens. Because otherwise, you just, how do you know?
Yeah,
And
exactly.
one of the points which was made in the panels earlier as well was indicators and tying it with the flexibility of wargaming or scenario analysis.
Right.
That's what it's about, is creating projections or creating for what if this happens. We can't predict when a war would happen, but what if it happens? What would that mean? What if this disaster scenario happens? So really creating that interaction with the data is a lot of where a lot of answers are, because it's question and answer. What's my big question today may not be tomorrow. Something may happen today that would.
Right, and then it's not a yearly thing, right? You don't release a version every year. You have a living tool that people play around with and see, if I do this, it's going to go up by this much. If I do that, it's going to go down. And how do you use
And
that?
then it becomes not just a monitor, but also
It's a
a
decision.
tool
For
for
decision
building collecting the data and using the data becomes a tool for building capacity.
Exactly.
And that's, I think, the
And then there's a
value
feedback
of-
loop that goes back in. Anyway, I'll open it up to the audience as well now. You have some exciting discussions, and there's a question there.
My question is for Cynthia. Hi, Cynthia.
Hi.
Hi, Ira Feldman. I don't think the challenge at the corporate level, which is where you're focusing, is on big data. It's on any data at all with respect to adaptation, because I think the truth of the matter is the situation is much more challenging than any of the panelists have led us to believe with respect to corporate data, because no one right now is collecting corporate data on adaptation activities, and even if they were, those activities would not necessarily be identified as adaptation activities.
Right.
And even if they were, it's clear that there will never be something equivalent to a greenhouse gas footprint that would be an adaptation footprint for corporate entities. So having said all that and seeing that you're agreeing for the most part, where are we going to get the data on corporate adaptation activities to become of use for any purpose, whether it's resiliency, preparedness, or policy, or anything else that we've been discussing?
Yeah. Well, I think it is obviously an evolution, and we're on a journey, and we're moving too slowly, clearly. But I thought that the CDP's request for a internal carbon price was in some respects really interesting. I mean, you hadn't seen that before. That is an agency essentially that's expanded the kind of data that they moved out from carbon to water and looking at those kinds of things. I think that I was speaking with someone, some of the data's out there, but it's really difficult to actually access and find and then compare. And then it's kind of kept a little bit obscure. And to the extent that much of this is happening at among companies that are the largest in the world, we're not seeing, it drops off so dramatically once you sort of under $1 billion in revenue, both the voluntary reporting and the transparency. And I've worked with, many companies that will actually have some very important data internally and are actually, because of some pressure that they might have, are doing an internal full-on sustainability report that would be completely consistent with the GRI and whatnot, and they, for lots of reasons, decide not to even make it public. So there's sort of that going on as well. And that's not to mention all the privately held companies and on and on. And so I think that, it's just a continued process of transparency, of asking for the data, putting pressure on companies, comparing that data, finding better ways to measure. There are, we get true cost data, for example, or we might have data that's what I'll call real data, and so it's pounds of carbon, or it might be that we translate into a rating. And it's really hard because we're sort of in these early stages. But I think there are some proxies for some of this, and we're making guesses at this point and in the translation. So not a great answer, but I think it's a journey.
Take one question.
Yeah, hearing the three of you talk about that, there's this one thought that comes to my mind. Cynthia, you particularly talked about that list of 90% of where the emissions are coming from, that Guardian article. And you look at that, okay, there's billions of people behind who want clean, cheap energy, and that's what is driving the fact that those big companies are listed there. And even if you drill down further, for example, the carbon budget came out for 2013 a couple of weeks ago, and we found out that after Kyoto, the reduction in growth from mature markets barely made up for the embedded carbon in all the manufacturing that was shipped to emerging markets. So clearly, manufacturing was shipped abroad without strings attached. So it's still not actionable. Whereas you look at something like climate adaptation data, the gain index data, the nuts and bolts of it, there's something inherent about it that makes it actionable. And I would say that it's because the data, the context is not inventory, it's impact. When you talk about the vulnerability and the readiness, it's not about the granularity of the data, it's not about the quantity of the data, it's about the context of the data. And while climate mitigation data is focused on inventorying and assigning blame, climate adaptation data inherently is about actionable information.
Yeah.
We'll take one more question and.
Hi, Catherine Winkler from EMC Corporation. Just a couple of things, comment for Cynthia. I actually would argue for a bit that I think carbon pricing, although that's something we're looking at ourselves and very important tool, is not I don't believe is an indicator for climate adaptation.
No, I'm sorry if I implied that.
Yeah. But thank you. Amy, I thought your comments were really very refreshing, and it reminded me of a graduation speech I recently heard where the principal said he had been to a zoo and they had a baby elephant there, and he said they're not planning to have the elephant grow by weighing it all day. They're actually planning to feed it. So. I was wondering if you had an example of where observation was actually having a negative impact, specifically with regard to climate adaptation or climate mitigation even.
Well, I think that one is, there's an example that I read the study about the bumps as well. I think that what I was getting at there is two things. One is if you're observing and you're not seeing people, then you are making decisions that could actually be making the people who are most vulnerable even more vulnerable because you're ignoring them because they're not being seen. So that's one. But I actually was also getting at, in terms of this issue of the observer effect, that if you are observing people in a way that is taking information from them and taking their power from them, then they become less vulnerable. So let me provide it in the opposite one, in an example which might empower them. So, there's a lot of crowdsourcing platforms now. Some of them are crowdsourcing platforms that are then taken by a third party to analyze what's the vulnerability of that system. But if you imagine if you had a system where you actually had a community that said, we are going to track our community because when we're in Sandy, if Sandy hits us next time, we don't want to be the blank spot. We want to know where our community is. We want to have the social capital to be able to respond. Then that empowers them to be more involved. Now, incentives, I agree, but I do think that you can say, instead of just letting the phone company track your phones, you could set up a system where you said it also is collectively can be used for our community good, And so by observing it, you can either say, okay, the government's going to observe me, Google's going to observe me, and I feel less empowered, then I'm not going to be as engaged. But if I say my community's going to we're going to observe ourselves, then it becomes, oh, by observing me, I'm affecting, the resilience of the community. I don't know if is that.
I mean, so let me give a couple examples. Surveys are a great influencing tool. You think of them as data collection tools, but you can design, and people do that all the time. They design surveys specific to change opinion, not to collect data. So that's a perfect example. Social media is getting to be that way, right? So if the goal of a lot of things is sharing, it's changing to be, you can influence, so customer service problems. People start acting differently because they know the data is being monitored, and they know they're going to be, because they're being collected, the data starts changing. So whenever you realize that your actions are resulting in data that is being collected and analyzed and acted upon, you will change that data, especially if it's humans making those decisions. Now, passive data collection is different. If you have sensors sitting and measuring things and nobody knows they exist, that's unlikely to change the data, and that's unlikely to hurt the system. But if it's active data collection where you are interacting with the subject of the collection, then of the data generation, then you can see that's a risk.
Thank you. Let's thank you all for your participation, and let's thank our panelists. Thank you.
Thank you all so much. So much to learn from for the ND Gain team, so I appreciate that very much. So now we're going to hear a word from Madame Cristiana Figueres. She is, of course, many of you know, the Executive Secretary of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, and wasn't able to join us today, but she has prepared some remarks, and immediately following her remarks, we will enjoy some more feedback on tools for adaptation.
Hello, everyone. I appreciate the opportunity to address the Global Adaptation Index annual meeting and thank Notre Dame for inviting me to join you today in this low-carbon manner. I'm especially pleased to have the opportunity to discuss the space where climate change and data intersect, because data is emerging as a powerful force in meeting the challenge of climate change. I see data as a silent but potent ally to help us understand climate change and move us closer to climate solutions. Let me explain. It is not enough to simply say climate change is real and it is human caused. The data to back up this claim must exist, or there is no recognition of the size and urgency of the problem. And this data does exist, authoritatively brought together in the recent IPCC Fifth Assessment Report. It is not enough to simply say that climate change poses a risk to business models and economic systems. The data to back up this claim must exist, or business will not consider climate in risk management. And this data does exist in many reports, such as the Carbon Disclosure Project Global 500 report and the Climate Change Scenarios Implications for Strategic Asset Allocation, the study performed for Norway's Sovereign Wealth Fund. This data is proving valuable, and more has been requested by a group of 70 global investors managing more than $3 trillion in assets. These investors want data that assesses the financial risks posed by climate change. And it is not enough to simply say that there are viable, even profitable, options for acting on climate change, and many are already acting. The data to back up this claim must exist, or governments and private sector actors will not explore their own low-carbon options. And this data does exist in countless examples that show the cost of renewable energy deployment falling worldwide and the rate of deployment soaring, in examples that show the trillions of dollars potentially gained from efficiency improvement, and in examples that show low carbon is a development option that helps achieve security, health, and resource management goals. So data has improved our understanding of the climate change challenge, the risk involved, and the viability of options that minimize risk, maximize reward, or better still, do both. We now look to data in the crucial years ahead to further our understanding, to catalyze business and government action, and to aid in decision-making that increases resilience and adaptability, especially for the world's most vulnerable populations. This is only possible if leaders of government, leaders of industry, and leaders of communities have access to data in ways that are easy to understand and easy to use. The ND Gain Index is one such interactive tool that gives users a look at data to help manage risks, gauge vulnerability, and honestly assess readiness. As data sets become larger and more complex, and we have every reason to believe we're quickly moving into the era of big data, the tools that translate this data into usable information are ultimately the tools that make a big difference for communities struggling to adapt to the effects of climate change. I therefore applaud the work of the Notre Dame Global Adaptation Index and encourage you to build on the progress you have made. I encourage you to engage governments and private sector actors to help them realize the value of the understanding provided by data and raise awareness of how acting on climate change benefits human populations, corporate value chains, and the planet. This is crucial now more than ever before, as the international community moves towards a new universal climate agreement in 2015. National governments and private sector understanding of the benefits of climate action is common ground that brings the world closer to an ambitious and effective new climate agreement. Your work can help us achieve that. Your work can help put us on the path to a low-carbon, high-resilient future and to sustainable economic development for all. Data must be our silent ally no longer. We must give it voice and bring it to the forefront of the climate challenge. Future generations will be able to look back and ask, why did we not act when we had the data that says we should do so urgently? Now is our opportunity to show future generations that we did make the data and its implications accessible, that we did act on the basis of that data. Future generations are counting on you. I thank you.
All of our panelists are. And with that inspirational message, we move on to our final panel of the day. Thank you, everyone. We know we sit between you and refreshments and dinner, but we hope this will be an engaging and interesting panel. It very much continues on the theme of the last panel, where we're going to focus on tools for adaptation and other kinds of adaptation-related decision-making. Our panelists, we have three distinguished panelists with us here today. Stephen Donofrio from CDP North America, which was referenced at least twice in the last half an hour. Elizabeth Selig from Conservation International, who will talk to us about the Ocean Health Index. And Ian Noble, who is a consultant to ND Gain and also a long participant in a variety of indicators in the climate change adaptation space. Each of them will talk about their own experiences, their own tools and data, and also trends and things they see coming down the pipe in terms of future application of data and tools. So with their permission, because we're talking about tools,
And because maybe you've heard there is a tool that we are all here gathering to discuss, the GAIN Index, I'm going to break a little bit from tradition with the rest of today's panels and show a few slides myself. And you will hear more tomorrow about ND GAIN in our press event and our release of our 2013 data and some interesting new results from the ND GAIN. But I want to set the stage for thinking about these kind of tools and use ND GAIN very briefly as an example. And this will be relevant for each of the panelists' presentations as well. So when we talk about adapting, we're talking about climate change, of course. But let's remember there are many forces acting that are changing the way our planet functions, and we need to adapt to those at the same time that we adapt to a changing climate. And we will claim on this panel, and certainly ND GAIN would claim, that tools, data, and indices can help inform decision making and help us to understand these processes. And specifically, there's a growing marketplace for climate change adaptation. There are a few data points up here, dollar figures. The Green Climate Fund is an emerging source of resources. It's pledged $100 billion by 2020. There are projections for growth in the global infrastructure industry related to adaptation. Emerging natural disasters that are costing large amounts of money, several of which have been quite extreme in the recent past, and lots of emerging corporate executives seeing risks in their supply chains. And again, we would say, can tools and data and indices help to inform how these markets play out? And I guess I also neglected to, introduce myself here when I show a couple of slides on ND GAIN. There are a number of resources and tools available in the climate change adaptation space. We'll see a couple examples today. Here's a slide that lists a number. So there are a number of, these are individuals and organizations attempting to align information and put it and put relevant information into the hands of decision makers. ND GAIN is one of these resources. I'm Jessica Hellman. I'm a professor of biology at the University of Notre Dame and the research lead on ND GAIN, so I play a leadership role in the development and the application of ND GAIN. ND GAIN is one of these kinds of indicators. It's attempting to it gathers information and delivers it to users with an emphasis on the private sector, but with application to many other sectors, including the public sector and non-governmental organizations. So here, for example, is some analyses that we performed for Catholic Relief Services, where we show at the country level. This helped Catholic Relief Services envision all of the countries in which it has active programs. What are the risks and the opportunities that these countries experience? So the index helps inform an organization like Catholic Relief Services. But a good index, including ND GAIN, will enable you to dig deeper and get into the data. You can look at it at country level, at the level of the entire index. But imagine you wanted to dive deeper. So here's a hypothetical example. Let's say you were a corporation. Let's say you were a bottling company and you're looking to expand operations in Southern Africa. Well, you might look at the index as a whole, but there might be certain dimensions of the index that are particularly informative. You might be interested in all countries, but you might also be interested in a particular region. So this is just, I'm not intending for you to consume the details of this graphic, but to show the kind of detailed analysis that you could do. Here are a number of different dimensions of ND GAIN. In this case, V stands for dimensions that are part of vulnerability. R stands for pieces of readiness. And we could compare, in this case, say 5 different countries. And we could say, along these different dimensions that are important to me as a bottling company, how do my different countries rank and compare? So an index should enable this kind of analysis and visualization. And we were going to talk in this panel about future trends. Where are indices and tools going? ND GAIN, of course, has a future ahead of it, and there are a number of things that we're planning, and we think we're representative of tool development in general. We're looking to downscale. A lot of indicators of climate change adaptation, and there's been discussion on previous panels about a lot of adaptation action being at the local scale. So we need to provide that information to decision makers at finer resolution. We need, and also in the last panel discussed about putting data in the hands of people who want to use it, and in a customizable way that makes sense to them. It's one thing to provide information, it's another thing to allow a user to consume the information that's most important to them. We also are interested in working on developing case studies to help people understand the utility of tools. Just because a tool is available doesn't mean that anyone knows how to use it or how best to apply it. And the other is we want to indicate large ideas, but we also want to be able to have specific utility. ND GAIN covers a variety of sectors: water, food, infrastructure, ecosystems, and so on, health. But we can also dig down into those individual indicators to get a sense of what is the food and water situation for an individual country, let's say. So these are examples of future trends as we see them at ND GAIN. And with that, I'm going to turn over the slides to our first panelist, and we'll hear from each of our respective panelists. Stephen, please.
Great, thank you. So I think we'll stick on this slide for a minute or two.
Tell me when to advance.
Will do. Thank you very much. And I swear I had nothing to do with the two plugs just a moment ago. But thank you very much to Cynthia. CSRHub is a carbon software partner to CDP. So we do have a number of alliances with different organizations out there, and they are one of them. And Christiana Figueres has been a huge supporter of CDP throughout the years. She's spoken on our global forums, but I had nothing to do with that plug there in that film. Just wanted to say thank you quickly for having CDP here. I think it's a great opportunity for us to talk about the value of what I heard before, data collection, which is then converted into information development. Data, if it sits in a black box, sits on itself, is not useful to anybody. So increasingly at CDP, we're trying to find avenues to find the best and most mileage out of the data that companies do disclose. This is companies as well as cities. So we've grown our programs to now include a large group of cities, 110 in this past year of disclosure. Most of them are the C40 large global cities. There are very small cities with very low populations as well. The next slide. But by offering a global disclosure mechanism, which is now including natural capital, not just climate change, but also water and deforestation-related issues, what we're doing is providing an opportunity for companies and cities to provide the story. So rather than just providing the numbers of your greenhouse gas emissions or the water you're consuming and how much you're recycling, the strategy behind the numbers are really important to your stakeholders. And so that's really the value of the CDP process, is to go deeper than just those quantification, the quantification component of your reporting. So what does this do? That story provides a glimpse into the intricacies of your carbon management strategy, your water management strategy, a pulse on your understanding of the related risks and opportunities, as well as the insights into the actions that companies and cities are taking to manage those risks. So going to the thought about adaptation, understanding what is adaptation in and of itself, it's dealing with a current problem. We do ask companies and cities to mention the risks that they're currently faced, the cost of those risks, and the actions that they're taking to manage those risks. So that information is available within the CDP system, and I'd be happy to help you find that. Next slide. So just for a quick backdrop, we at CDP have been in development for about 13 years, requesting disclosure since 2002, launching our first report in 2003 from companies in the Global 500 Index. There are now about 5,000 companies just under that are disclosing worldwide in over 65 countries, representing about 70% of the S&P 500, 82 or 81% depending on the year of the Global 500. But thinking about what does that mean in terms of global terms, that's over half of the world's listed market capitalization. So we've now hit a very significant point, and we're starting to go deeper into the work that we do and looking at more in sector-specific approaches. But the ways that investors use the data, it's important to take a look at the different ways, because there's more than just one, and there's a variety, and not all investors in different geographies are using it exactly the same way, or using the CDP disclosure system in the same way. So I think primarily they're using it to rank, score, and compare companies, either directly taking the CDP data or going to our partners such as Bloomberg and Thomson Reuters, Sustainalytics, TrueCost, any of these folks that are taking data from multiple sources, integrating that into broader ESG metrics. They're also using our indices. So CDP reestablished our leadership group of companies. It's important to do this every year. It's companies like competition. They like to be on the top of the list. So we do this for two key metrics. One is disclosure transparency, and one is the performance, the actions you're taking to manage climate change. And if you look at these indexes that we establish, which they're based on the performance and the top companies in disclosure, they outperform financially. If you take a backcasted look of their performance on financial markets, they outperform the benchmark indexes. And we've done this analysis for Global 500, S&P 500, and in Canada we have a sample as well that we've done this for. They also use it for company engagement. So arguably, if you're talking to a company that is a poor performer on CDP, they don't rank very well, maybe this is a good opportunity for you as an investor to engage with that company and help them see the path that you want them to go down when it comes to climate, water, deforestation related sustainability. There's also companies that are using this for exclusion and divestment criteria, so actually taking stocks out of their portfolios if they don't meet their standards. It could be as simple as not disclosing the CDP, which would be the very extreme case, or it could be the fact that a company is not reacting to a request from an investor to improve on certain areas of their disclosure. There's also development of ESG metrics, which I spoke about before, taking this and incorporating it into larger environmental, social, and governance criteria, as well as managing risks. So taking a look at your portfolio as an investor and trying to analyze where the risks are within your portfolio, and then trying to find the best in class type of companies that could potentially replace those investments. Next slide. Well, I did have just one more thing, and I don't have a slide on it, but wanted to quickly talk about the cities program. We had, as I mentioned, about 110 cities this past year disclose, and it's not happening so much now, but it will begin to occur as we've had storms like Superstorm Sandy that have clearly affected the ability for a city to have business continuity. And there are losses not just to the physical environment, but to the businesses and their operations that happen within those cities. So in New York State last year, New York State and municipalities sold about $44.5 billion worth of municipal bonds, worth of bonds in 2012. And this is according to Bloomberg, and that's the most since 2003. So the investment is increasing, it is very high. And as these storms continue to increase, how does that affect the way that municipal bonds are rated in their risk assessment? So that's a question that those risk agencies will determine. So more understanding of these issues equals more demand. And that's what we're seeing in this slide here. So when CDP began back in 2003, there was a very small group of investors that were on that vanguard that said, we need more information about our holdings. We don't have this information available to us. So the CDP tool was to sit there and say, okay, let's ask the right questions. And gradually we built from a one-page questionnaire to a multi-page questionnaire. But going from 35 investors in 2003, 4.5 trillion in assets at that point, to now 722 investors, 87 trillion in assets. In the US alone, we have 124 institutional investors with 21 trillion in assets. So next slide. The risks that are being disclosed by US companies, and what this is maybe a complicated slide to take a look at now, but just to summarize a few very key points. For US companies in the S&P 500, risks could include changes to the physical environment, and that could be a result of extreme weather events. It could occur from regulatory changes, so that could be cap and trade, carbon tax, as well as consumer preference behavior changes. In the US, 63% of these risks that were reported are near term. They're going to happen in the next 1 to 5 years, according to companies. And 75% of them are expected to impact their direct operations. 3/4. And then furthermore, the costs are being understood. So it's not just the risks exist, but the risks are expected to have operational costs as well as to reduce the demand for current goods and services. Next slide. And then in cities, as I mentioned, New York City, Hurricane Sandy amounted to $19 billion in damages. This is reported by the city of New York in their past disclosure. They also reported that they expect the probability of a storm causing New York City as much damage will increase by 17% by 2020s and 40% by 2050s. Chicago is another example. What they're doing is they're investing in creating jobs and in economic growth through sustainability. They're doing this to build a more healthier, livable city that they're hoping will attract additional investment. They're expecting $8 billion in public and private investments over the next decade as a result of that activity. Next slide. So as I mentioned, what is a data set without it being a source of information and a source of insights? So I think it's critical to think about who could this inform and what types of decisions could those be that they're informing. So as a raw data set, it is available. You can access that. You can use that, manipulate it in your own way, rank a company based on how many companies in the energy sector are setting targets, as we heard about before, pricing on carbon, which I'll talk about in just a minute. But there also are partners that provide ESG analytics, as I mentioned. We've done a few things in the past year in CDP North America to try to bring this data out and make it usable and contextual for different groups of our stakeholders. One of them being the corporate community. So if you're a company and you're wondering, how do I reduce emissions but do it profitably? We've done an analysis of the emission reduction activities that have been disclosed through CDP from the US corporate sector. And we've analyzed out of those companies with WWF and McKinsey, we've taken a look to understand can reductions according to the climate science predictions of 2 degrees increase in Celsius, can the US corporate sector reduce those emissions and do so profitably? The reported emission reduction activities by the US corporate sector indicated that yes, it can be done. And we provided a roadmap for how that can be done through energy efficiency and renewable energy investments. And this is all being done, this all can be done profitably by the year 2020. Another piece of insight is for the investment community. Sustainable Insight Capital Management was our partner for this report. What we did was we tried to take a look at leading companies on disclosure engagement. And so these are the companies that rank in the top of our leadership indexes. It's important to try to find value in that leadership effort. And so what we did was we took a look at some 3 key metrics: return on equity, dividend growth, and cash flow stability. In each one of those key investment criteria, the companies that are leading in disclosure engagement outperformed the benchmark. And we did this with the Global 500 Index. And then for policy decision makers, we heard from this from Cynthia. Thank you very much. I don't have to go into all that much detail. But pulling out and extracting those components of the story is really important. And so carbon pricing, we've been asking this question for a number of years, but we never did anything with it. And arguably, companies have been pricing carbon in the US for many years now. But it's important to pull that out and show which companies are actually planning for that and using that in their planning for their corporations in the future, but also reporting that it will not, or at least they're not citing that it will impact their business in a negative way by having those prices. So that's just a quick summary of what CDP does and how we try to bring the data out from just being data and into information that can be used for decision making. So really thinking of it as a tool and how it can be utilized by different stakeholder groups. So look forward to your questions in just a little bit. Thank you.
Yep. Your first slide. Okay. Thank you so much for having me, and it's been really interesting to learn about the work that you all are doing. And I think that this will appear to be a little bit of an outlier in this group, in that the Ocean Health Index is not explicitly about adaptation. So I want to just get that out front. But I think there's a lot of commonalities that we all face in the design of these kinds of indices and how to design them so that we incorporate management levers into them, and we face a lot of similar challenges. So I think it is really helpful to kind of be able to learn from each other and see how other people approach similar types of challenges. So the Ocean Health Index is, although I'm speaking about it today, is really the work of about 65 scientists. And we designed it as a tool for trying to assess the health of our oceans. And we did this based on a very specific definition. Next slide. This definition is so important because it was really foundational to how we design the index and how it affected a lot of the decisions we made about its design. So our definition is a healthy ocean is one that delivers a range of benefits to people now and in the future. And I want to point out a couple of things about this definition. One is that we're talking about a range of benefits. So we designed the index to look at a portfolio of benefits that people have for a healthy ocean. And the other is this idea of now and into the future. So we tried to design the index in such a way that we wouldn't be maximizing short-term benefits at the expense of long-term benefits. So just to get those things out there and think about them as I talk about some of our results. Next slide. So that portfolio of benefits that I referenced, we looked at the ability of the ocean to deliver sustainably benefits across 10 goals that people have for a healthy ocean. So it's a little hard to read. So those 10 goals are artisanal fishing opportunities, biodiversity, coastal protection, carbon storage, clean waters, food provision, tourism and recreation, coastal livelihoods and economies, natural products, and sense of place. Within a few of those goals, we look at sub-goals, but I think those 10 goals represent sort of the broad base of things that we were trying to assess in the index. So the global score is 65, which indicates a lot of room for improvement because it's out of 100. So, and I wanted to just mention a couple things about how we designed the index. So each of the goal scores, you can see, for example, we calculate a score for each of our goals. So artisanal fishing opportunities here is 95. And each goal score includes a measure of status, and our status looks at a present state relative to a reference point or target. And the development of those reference points was a real challenge, but they're so foundational to what makes, I think, the index useful as a management tool because it explicitly incorporates a target. So that constitutes 50% of a goal score. The other 50% of the goal score is based on the trend in status over the last 5 years, the pressures on that status, of which climate is one, and we incorporated data on temperature and ocean acidification. And the third piece of that is what we refer to as resilience, which includes governance mechanisms or management that could mitigate those pressures. So we refer to this sort of package of trends, pressures, and resilience as an indication of the goal's likely future state, which is sort of where we think it's heading in the next 5 years. And we recalculate that every year. Next slide. So this is the global index scores for 2013. And you can see a couple of interesting spatial patterns. One is that the exclusive economic zones of West Africa and Southeast Asia include some of the lower scores. The colors are a little hard to see. But I think that largely reflects very low scores for fisheries and food provision, and also low resilience scores. So our work suggests that the governance mechanisms are not necessarily in place to really mitigate the pressures that a lot of these ocean systems are facing. Some of the higher scores you can see are in some relatively uninhabited and unimpacted parts of the oceans, but we also had relatively high scores in places like Germany and other developed countries that have developed effective environmental policies for mitigating a lot of these impacts. Next slide. In addition to visualizing things as maps, one of the things that we do to visualize our data is the use of these petal plots. So this is all of the same type of information that was contained in the previous 2 slides, but I think this is really useful for a couple of things that we feel are really important in terms of management guidance that the index can provide. So each of these slices of the pie, so to speak, the ones that extend furthest out to the edge have the highest scores, and the ones that have the lowest scores are closest in. So I think one of the things that makes this a useful visualization is that over time you can see whether or not an increase in one goal has resulted in the decrease of another goal. So we expect, and the index is designed to show some of these trade-offs, so that if you, for example, have an increase in fisheries production, you may see a decrease in biodiversity. Another thing that I think is really useful here is that it highlights when we do these for each country, you can see that there are many different paths to sustainability. So even though many countries may have the same score, their goal scores are actually quite different. So there's a lot of different paths to getting to a sustainable future for the oceans. And next slide. Because this is a very short introduction to the Ocean Health Index, I'd encourage you to check out our website, which enables you to dig into some of the data, some of the visualizations for each country, and also include some information about our upcoming work, which includes the development of a toolbox so that countries and policymakers can put in data themselves and try and do some of their own sort of ground up calculations of the index. We really don't want to be the sole calculators of the index, because we don't feel that it's a sustainable thing in terms of being able to give guidance to policymakers. We've also been focusing on the downscaling. We have a few case studies that we're doing in different countries around the world, including the west coast of the US, Brazil, Fiji, with some other ones planned in the next couple of years. So I encourage you to check out the website, and thank you very much for having me here.
Thank you, Elizabeth. All right, Ian.
Okay, can you just put up? Okay, just put up the first slide, and I won't use the rest until near the end.
Okay. You let me know when.
Okay, well, thank you for the opportunity to be here, and the importance of this slide I hope, will become clearer near the end of my comments. But let me firstly just say how I got to be sitting here. I started out as a pure research scientist, got interested in how landscapes developed with grazing animals, with fire, and then with climate change. And as the breadth got wider, I found myself moving from doing science to having to lead scientific teams. And an opportunity came along to do a 1-year secondment with the bank to actually use science. Well, that 1 year spread to 12, and I'm still here in Washington. But I have retired from the bank, and while at the bank I had many discussions that actually Amy almost gave a perfect description of some of those discussions that I had. Beware of indices, certainly in the adaptation area. They can be misleading, there can be problems. At one stage, one of my directors said, "I'm sorry, but I do want to have evidence that the least developed countries are the most vulnerable to climate change." And yes, that we could do, and we developed such a data set to demonstrate that quite clearly. As I was about to leave the bank, at the same time, about the same time as Juan Jose was about to leave the bank, he came to me and said, "I want you to come and work with me on developing an index for adaptation," which seemed a very strange request to be asking me to do something like that. But as you might have noted, Juan Jose is an enthusiast and he's persuasive. And also, he had a different idea. He wanted an index that should be used to raise awareness, basically, and also an index which was focused as much on the private sector, if not more on the private sector, than on the public sector. And as someone who had been saying all the time, we need to raise awareness and adaptation, and we need to engage the private sector, then I thought I had to be engaged in such a project. Now, I had many questions. And I think actually Joyce Coffey's comments at the beginning of this meeting, which she felt that in her course you'll come out with more questions than answers, or I can't quite remember your quote. I think that's what raising awareness leads to. Raising awareness does not lead to an answer, and a simple answer, and the belief in the result of that index or your ranking, but to questions as to, well, why does my country rank here? Why is it like this? What is leading to this? And that, to me, is the power of having an index like this. Underneath that index is a very rich database. There are about 50 measures that go into the index at the moment. I have about 500 adaptation relevant measures sitting on my computer that we drew upon and used some, rejected some for all sorts of reasons. You maybe hear more about that later. It's also on the web. One of the questions that we have to tackle all along is also, why are we trying to measure something as vague and disputed as terms like vulnerability, or, as some people would prefer to say, resilience? It's the flip side. If I'd made that statement just then in front of a group of scientists, I would have started an argument straight away, because some people will tell you in great detail why vulnerability and resilience are very different concepts. So the academic community is not in agreement in this area. One is I also wanted to introduce the concept of readiness. Now, what does that mean? Now, after a lot of thought, we agreed that essentially what we were talking about was the ability of a country to absorb investment, either by the government or by an MDB or by the private sector, and use it effectively to reduce that country's vulnerability. Now, there are many other ways that readiness can be defined, and you can have different target groups. You could look more at the philanthropic community. You look at more at assisting NGOs in doing some of the tasks that they're doing. But that's how we define readiness and gain in this situation. Now, there are many other ways that indices can be used. One of the points we made clear right from the outset was that gain was not meant to be an allocation index. One of the very reasons why I thought we should not develop such an index in the bank. Even if it was not meant to be used for allocation, it would be seen that way and possibly even used that way, which would be a misuse of it. However, in the longer run, we can't afford to walk away from that issue, because Jessica's already mentioned the Green Climate Fund. Now, the Green Climate Fund has been agreed to in the climate change negotiations. Whether it will come into, well, it exists already. The Secretariat is being set up in South Korea at the moment. The goal is $100 billion per year in mitigation and adaptation, with roughly a 50-50 split, so $50 billion a year for adaptation. Now, most people do not believe they'll get to those sorts of numbers, but I think everyone agrees that we have to get close to that if the climate change talks are to go ahead. Otherwise, the least developed countries or the developing countries are likely simply to walk away. Now, tens of billions of dollars per year cannot be handled without some form of allocation formula. A number of countries have foreseen this already, and in fact they've come to GAIN and to me to ask, how do we go about doing allocation? So we can't get away from the allocation issue. But that was not what the GAIN index was produced for. The GAIN index was produced to gain awareness, to develop a sense of, well, why is my country where it is? Why isn't it ranking above another country? What factors are pushing my country down or up? And people like Juan Jose have used this very, very effectively. I think the profile of adaptation in places like the World Economic Forum have gone up enormously because he's had a tool like this to use. Another way that the indices like this can be used is understanding adaptation better. Asking some of the questions I was just then. I mean, why are things the way they are? What can my country do to improve the situation? What might be the most effective way of going ahead? Why do we differ from that country? Now, this sort of analysis, I think, is just barely started. One of the decisions we made in developing the GAIN index was that we would not use any measure which included GDP per capita. One, I don't like GDP as a measure to start with, but many developing countries had argued that we're being penalised twice in many of these indices, not just indices around adaptation, but all sorts of poverty indices, etc. Because GDP per capita appears in it, and we're poor, and therefore we're low. And then they throw in a whole lot of other factors associated with being in poverty, and therefore we're doubly penalised. So we decided to keep it out of the GAIN index. Interestingly enough, the GAIN index actually correlates very highly with GDP per capita, which I guess you'd have to expect because poverty and vulnerability and lack of readiness are all linked. But that was an outcome, not an input. We also decided not to use any of the recent data collection on the impact of climate change disaster, or climate-related disasters on countries, because we wanted to keep that firstly as a second set of data to get people interested in looking further into information, but also to check whether the index itself had any meaning. And I'll come to that in a second. So the core purpose of GAIN is really to get people asking those questions. But to do that, we had to have a product that we knew had at least some solid basis in the science behind it. So have the next slide. I'll have the first slide. So one of the first questions that we had to ask was, how do you actually form an index? Now, this is a technical question. Do you just simply get a lot of measures and add them up and divide by the number of measures? Do you actually use a geometric mean? You multiply them all together and take the nth root. Do you use more complex things? Do you use a ranking system? Now, the academic community can go on about this for forever. But here's just one simple example. Here's the GAIN index calculated one way as essentially an additive average, and the other way where we simply did a ranking and summed the ranks and did it that way. And you'll see that, yes, there's a scatter, but there's not a huge difference between the two methodologies. Next slide. We also recognised, well, one of the important issues about GAIN was that it was to be a time series. We were to go back to have data back to 1995, and I believe we could probably go back a little bit beyond before that if needed. But of course, there's a lot of missing data in that. Countries are not reporting many of the measures right even now. And the question was, can we get by with a certain amount of missing data? And here's a result of some analyses, some simulations, where I simply asked, I took out 1/3 at random, 1/3 of the measures that went into the GAIN index and calculated the scores and ranked the countries. And I did this hundreds of times, basically. And what you see here is the outcome. Now, the question I was asking is, would the most vulnerable 25 countries stay up there amongst the most vulnerable countries, and vice versa, would the least vulnerable countries stay there? If the index had been perfect, you would have seen a line which came out from the 100 and just got to 25 and plummeted down to the base and then went across. If it was just a purely random, you'd see the lines as they occurs. So in fact, it does show that even up to 1/3 of missing data doesn't actually change the outcome hugely. So we could afford to work with some missing data in the whole process, and therefore do the index for, I think we would do 177 countries out of 192 UN, sorry, now it's 193, South Sudan is going to be a problem, countries. So things like that have been tested. Next one. Does the GAIN index, and here the vulnerability component of it, does it actually relate to climate-related disasters? Remember, we said none of that went into the input, and here you see that if you have low vulnerability on the left, you have a low probability as an individual of being affected by a climate-related disaster in that country. So it does correlate and does show some back projections of current risks. Next one. We did the same with readiness. Now this was a bit more problematic because when we first looked at it, we said, we can't find that readiness really correlates with anything very sensible. Looked at foreign direct investment, for example. No. We looked at how much countries were receiving from the multilateral development banks. No relationship. But here we also looked at GDP growth, the percentage growth per year. No relationship when we first looked at it, until we split it into the least developed countries and the middle income countries versus the developed countries. And you can see that there is, it's small, but there is definitely a trend upwards as the countries that are more ready are growing faster. I think there's a lot more work to be done on readiness, but there is some message there already. Interesting question why it is that the developed countries go the other way. Now here's a question for the researchers to look further into this. And next slide. I've mentioned the fact that the challenge of allocation is there, and it's going to have to be faced. A couple of countries have come to me and said, we cannot go to our taxpayers and say we're putting some billions of dollars a year into an adaptation fund and not be able to demonstrate that there is some sound basis for making that allocation. So we do need to have some methodology. Other organisations have faced the same problem. Obviously, the development banks have faced this for a long while and have developed indices. They've been debated, modified, debated again, modified, but they are used and they have reasonable effectiveness. The GEF, Global Environment Fund, has had to develop certain allocation formulae. This shows you the relationship between two indices, the gain index and one developed by David, his name, I'm going to say Freeman. Sorry, it doesn't matter. What's what there? David Wheeler, sorry. People say, well, there's some relationship between those indices. Does it matter which one we use? Well, yes, it does, because use one index, one country would get 200 million, use another index and only get 100 million. And I can tell you that that would take some negotiations to get any one of those through. But this is a challenge we're going to have to face within the allocation area. It's not something that ND Gain has to face. That's a decision up to them, but it's one that the whole community will have to face. Next slide. And press it again. And now we're back to these two people. Because, in fact, the index is just that. It's an index. It is one way of presenting information. It's a window into asking more questions about why are things the way they are. Now, I was fortunate to spend the last 2 weeks, in fact, we got back about 10 o'clock last night, but 2 weeks in Australia, travelling with a group of leaders from developing countries and from different levels in those developing countries. We had essentially chieftains from Zambia who were advising both the government and also their own tribal groups on what to do on adaptation. We had a leader representing all of the NGOs in Samoa and many other Pacific countries, who was also essentially part of the Samoan, I don't know what you call it, the royal family, but the links there. We had people from Bangladesh who've been running the Bangladesh Adaptation Fund. And we brought all these people together to talk with groups in Australia, leaders who'd come forward there. In Australia, there is an Aboriginal community called the Yorta Yorta community. They have challenged both the rights to their land and the rights to actually help manage the adaptation of their land right through to the High Court or the Supreme Court equivalent. Unfortunately, they lost in their case. It was a case that was probably going to be lost, but they carried it through to that point. But they talked about how they wanted to manage their land and how they might go about it. They have charismatic leaders who have led through this whole process. But it was interesting to see this discussion that finally developed between the chieftains from Zambia, the lady from Samoa, talking to the Yorta Yorta people and saying, stop being victims. You've got so many good things going for you here. You've got new ideas. You've got, for example, you're losing your Indigenous knowledge. You're losing the knowledge of the elders. Children do not want to go out and be educated in the old ways. But in a new way that they've developed instead, they take an iPhone and a teenager and put them with an elder, and they go out and the elder tells them the stories while the whole thing is recorded on the iPhone and both video and sound. Now, a lot of that is secret information. So a software package has been developed so that the elders can control that information. They can control when they release it, if they ever release it. But it at least is being recorded, and of course the children are becoming engaged. So we have to get the multiple generations engaged. But when I look, the little bit of this they showed us, it was often about how many yams used to grow here, how big was the river then. It was about information. And so much of the exchange between all of those people was about information. Not the sort of information that will go into the GAIN index, but it does bring back this importance of information and appropriate information for appropriate reasons. And I think that is the challenge that we all have to face. The challenge with ND GAIN is where they want to take the GAIN index at the moment. I think a lot more research needs to be done about what has been put into the index so far. But I think what is a lot more important is how do you help people when they go to that next step? Juan Jose has got them enthused. Then they ask the questions of why is my country like this? Can I see more information? Can you show it to me in a way that's meaningful to me? I think that's the challenge with ND GAIN, and I'm happy to continue to help them while I can, but I'm happy also, as in this community here, is to gradually hand over. It's a pity that photograph's taken in that direction because it was taken in the Wadi Rum in Jordan. And if you know Wadi Rum, that's where Lawrence Arabia was filmed, so when you looked out the other direction, there was some magnificent scenery. But they are asking, how do we keep this, and how do we keep this part of our lifestyle? Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much. So I want to ask one small question of each of you, and then I'd like to open the floor to the audience. And this question is inspired, Stephen, actually by your referencing how you looked at your data to show examples of people doing things and achieving certain outcomes. I'm wondering if each of you might be able to cite an example that you know of data or an index, perhaps your own index, being used in a particular application that you think advanced decision making or raised awareness or some specific case. So can you cite a case for us that ties information and delivery of that information to a decision or some sort of advancement?
Yeah, and just because we're an investor organization, at least that's where we began, I'll take an investor perspective on this. And so it's actually a distant example. It's on the other side of the world almost, in South Africa. A bank called Nedbank has taken a look at the rankings of companies that are disclosing that are listed on the Johannesburg Stock Exchange. Pretty simple methodology. What they did, they created an index, a green index, based upon the top companies in terms of the transparency of their disclosure as the initial point, of which they would say that the companies above this point are eligible to be included in this index and those below are not. The second part of it was they then took the weighting of how well they performed. So the actions they were taking to mitigate their impact on climate change, if they were verifying their emissions, a few different criteria related to setting targets and meeting those targets, things that go into the actions, so the performance side of managing climate change. And that's the other side of our scoring methodology. So we have those two scores. They took above that threshold for transparency, and then when it came to performance, they weighted the companies that were the top performers, and we do this by letter band, A, B, C, D. And then, so what happened was the index was heavily weighted on the companies that were top disclosures, top performers. And when you take a look at that ETF, the exchange traded fund that is based on that index that Nedbank provides, it outperforms the standard or the benchmark index, Johannesburg Stock Exchange group of companies, by over 30%. And so then it's a question of liquidity, and it's a question of how many investors are buying that ETF and how much is it being transacted. But I think that's an example of a way that you can take a look at an index, or you can take a look at a ranking system and start to utilize it for your specific practice, this one being the investment community.
Yeah, so the Ocean Health Index was released in 2012. And as you might imagine, when it came out, some countries were particularly unhappy when they had relatively low scores. I think the fact that we looked across the sort of portfolio of benefits has led to a lot of conversations between different policy-making bodies within those countries that don't traditionally talk to each other around the issue of ocean health. So, for example, Colombia was not happy with their score, and the government directed ministers from various different ministries to come together to discuss the data issues, why they were scoring so poorly, whether or not they could bring new data to bear, how they could work together to improve the scores. And simply having those players around the table talking about issues related to ocean health was, I think, a deeply motivating thing to see, and I think will help to catalyze some change, hopefully, in the future.
Well, just in relation to the gain index, as it was then, ND gain hasn't been released as yet. I have, on a number of occasions, had to answer the question, why have you rated us like that, to what can we do about this? And that's led to interesting discussions. I'm sure one has had even more like that. But another example is that I was involved with the, through one of my last tasks at the bank, with the League of Arab States, where they wanted an analysis done of their adaptation options across all of the Arab countries. And we found ourselves initially going to governments and doing long explanations about how countries differed. And so finally, I simply produced the gain index data for them. I showed them both the vulnerability and the readiness. And that was a very useful starting graph to work with people. It immediately opened up the questions exactly the way I think that it was originally designed to do. So that I think was the opener for a much better dialogue. Mm-hmm. Everywhere from Saudi Arabia to Tunisia.
Mm-hmm. All right, questions from the audience. We have one, please, toward the back. Ira.
Yes, it's Ira again.
Please.
I have a quick question both for Stephen and for Elizabeth. Stephen, would you agree that it's easier to construct an index when the stock exchange itself requires certain types of disclosure just to be listed on that stock exchange, as in the case of Johannesburg? And Elizabeth, from the definition of your mission statement and then the different goals, it's very clear that it's an ecosystem services oriented model, and I was just wondering why you don't use that phrase in your public presentations. Thanks.
I guess I'll go first. Thanks, Ira. I would agree. I mean, I think there is a movement amongst exchanges to try to position themselves or understand their role in encouraging sustainability disclosure, in particular for greenhouse gas emissions or environmental disclosure, which is CDP's part of the equation. Absolutely, it helps to have the exchange behind you. There are other exchanges that are not necessarily requiring it, but it's more of a disclose or explain why not. On the flip side of it, however, I mean, in a situation like in the UK, when they decided to implement rules to require reporting of greenhouse gas emissions, it was easy for them to do it because companies were already disclosing through CDP and other systems. So the fact that we existed, the fact that companies were already engaged in this made it easier. So I think it goes both ways. We sort of enabled each other in a way.
So the question that relates to why we don't sort of frame it more in an ecosystem services context. A couple of things to point out. One is that even though several of the goals suggest an ecosystem service provision, we also have like a biodiversity goal, which is dealing more with the existence value and more of a traditional conservation perspective. So it's a mix, but also by design, we envisioned and wanted this to serve as a new conception of health that includes human beings and sort of a socio-ecological coupled system, because we don't think that you can really separate ocean health from human behavior and vice versa. So sometimes when I give a longer version of this presentation, I show a feedback loop that shows, that human health has consequences for ocean health. Ocean health has consequences for ecosystem service provision. Ecosystem service provision has consequences for human health. So we were really hoping and had kind of a secondary motivation for really trying to advance the idea of health from just a pure ecosystem perspective towards one that looked at this really through a coupled system view.
Ira, I think a powerful thing about indices too is that they could take something that's quite conceptual. Ecosystem services is a really informative, somewhat transformative concept, but it's awfully fuzzy too. And an index can say, here are the components that we are talking about. Or in the case of gain, ND gain, we could say, Ian referenced vulnerability and readiness. They're kind of lofty ideas. But here are the things we are using to measure them, which puts some meat on the bones of a concept analogous to ecosystem services, I think. Another question? Yes.
Thank you. Thank you for another great panel. My name is Emerson Rezende. I'm an independent consultant in climate change. My former life of working for the UN Climate Change Secretariat, I remember about 4 years ago or so, I had the chance to talk to Nigel Topping from the Chief Innovation Officer, if I'm not wrong, from CDP. And I posed to him the question, why not to develop indicators about adaptation, specifically about adaptation. And we had a long conversation about that. And he told me, Emerson, the challenge is quantification, basically. When you talk about climate change mitigation, we can clearly get that information out of companies much easier. Adaptation, we still struggle with that. And I was like, I know that we're also talking about issues related to competitiveness with these companies. They might not want to release this data because of those issues. But I think if you manage to ask the right questions, you might get the right answers that will help not only the companies to develop the resilience that they need, but help the whole sector to become more resilient. Let me just get to the question. The question is, of course, for Stephen. 4 years after, I think CDP has evolved much to get those questions right and get some of these answers. But we still see the indicators very timidly showing information on adaptation. Looking forward, how do you see that evolve? How do you see CDP providing more answers on resilience, on how these companies are resilient to climate change? Thank you.
I mean, I guess that brings up a good debate over the definition of resilience versus adaptation. And arguably, they're two different things. I mean, adaptation, changing for what's already happening versus resilience for preparing for what's to come is how I could define it. So I would kind of put them in potentially two different categories, or answer that question in a different way, which would be, as a company, you can, in your CDP disclosure, talk about things that have happened in the past, and then things that are happening in the near term, as well as things that are happening in the long term. And so by putting a time frame on the risks that you're reporting, saying this is the near term risk, this is the now risk, this is in 10 years, that enables the company to really report on those two different things, so whether it's adaptation or resiliency. So I think that that's maybe a starting point. As you said, we definitely have come a long way. If this was however many years ago that you spoke with Nigel, who's now our executive director, he, as well as all of us, understand that CDP has to evolve, but we also have to have our questions stay somewhat the same. And I think that the point that we're at now is we have a great set of questions. We need to take a close look on a sector level and see which sectors really do relate more so to resilience type of questions versus adaptation versus anything else. So I think that that's where we could potentially evolve to from here. But at the same time, it's not just up to CDP to create the index. So that's why it's the value of having partners and the value of having data that can be leveraged by other partners and be integrated into different indexes. So I think the concept of creating an adaptation index or a resilience index, if it were possible, I think there would be interest in doing so.
Can I just add to that, because I took part in a couple of the discussions with CDP about the design of the questionnaire for adaptation. I agree with Stephen on the points he's made. I mean, what I think did go in eventually is essentially it asks companies, are they really thinking about climate risk and adaptation? And that, I think, in itself is an enormous start. And to get people to sort of face the issue should not be, looked down upon. I think that's a big first step. And let's get that done first, and then see if we can improve.
Juan Jose, you have a comment or a question?
Thank you. I just wanted to make a comment using the index itself, because I think we would miss an opportunity if we don't play a little bit with it. While that is hopefully been done, I want to also recognize Dr. Bruno Sanchez, who's here and who worked with Ian from the very beginning in creating the original version of the index. He came from NASA to help us, so we do need sometimes rocket scientists to help us with some of these endeavors. But the point I wanted to make, based on one of the questions I heard, is that about 2 years ago, I'll give you 2 examples. One, I'll show it on the screen. About 2 years ago, I am invited to this conference in Romania with prime ministers and the ministers, the members of the European Parliament, to discuss several topics, and one of them was energy in the Black Sea. And the person who was supposed to run that panel was the head of the regulatory entity of Japan. And because of what happened with Fukuyama, he wasn't able to make it to this meeting in Romania. So they asked me if I could moderate that panel. And I said, look, I don't know anything about energy in the Black Sea. So I put the index and choose the 5 countries around the Black Sea, and just show how in the last 15 years the countries have performed according to the ND Gain Index. And that created the most interesting discussion one can think of. Prime ministers, members of parliament debating what particular law related to water, to health, to education, what kind of infrastructure investments actually made a particular country do better than others. And so the objective was achieved in terms of getting the discussion going in a topic that 4 years ago or 5 years ago, we wouldn't get the Secretary General of the UNFCCC to even mention the word adaptation. It was a bad word. I had conflicts at the bank when the chief scientist of the bank at that time asked me why I was talking about adaptation. So today, that seems to be no longer an issue. On the contrary, there is a lot of interest in doing more, precisely because I tend to believe that there is not going to be an agreement on the mitigation side of the equation, at least during our lifetime. There might be some regional agreements. So adaptation becomes extremely important. The second and very quick example, if we can go to the matrix itself, Jessica. I was in Querétaro, Mexico, a couple of months ago with an initiative called 1 Million Youth for Mexico. This is an initiative of about, right now, 10,000 young people who made it possible for Mexico to actually change their legislation in the education sector. And today, they help in the approval of the new energy legislation in Mexico. So this is a group of very active young people that do not belong to any political party, and that are actually using this tool as one means of conveying their message to the leaders of their country. And during that presentation, they were very interested about how the so-called BRIC countries were doing, and the fact that Mexico, BRICS doesn't have an M. Mexico is not part of the BRIC countries, and they wanted to compare themselves. If you don't mind typing China, we'll see China right now seems to be in the you put Mexico and China. Okay, so show me which one is which. I think Mexico will, that will be China, and Mexico is there. Put India, please. Russia.
Yeah, and you can run them through time. Is that what you want to do? No.
Excuse me? Yeah.
These countries actually move quite a bit. Over
Exactly. So we are missing South Africa. South Africa and Brazil. Okay? So that basically make the BRICS. I'm going to add the M in there. Okay? And that shows where they were in 2011. You have 2 countries in the green quadrant, 2 in the yellow, 1 in the blue, and 1 in the red. Don't put it in motion yet. Go to 1995, please. You can see that in 1995, all of them were in another quadrant different than the green quadrant, which is kind of where you would like countries to move to. That's an objective. And again, just to complement something that was said in the previous panel, the ND gain index is not a thermometer that tells you what the temperature is or a scale that tells you your weight. It is a navigation chart that allows decision makers to make more informed decisions. If you now put it in motion, Jessica, which is what I did with this group of young people, you can see how in the last 15, now 16 years, each of these countries has done. The internet is a little bit slow here, but it's usually much faster. But you can see how they move, how each of these countries move in the last 16 years. And you can, of course, stop at any time, go into the information and see what kind of legislation, what kind of public policy, what kind of investments for each of those countries in all of the variables actually made that shift to take place. So the value of the ND gain index is not necessarily in tell us that it is 6 p.m. and time to go for drinks, or a scientific description of the machine inside the clock. It's actually something that tells us it's time to, go for dinner or have something to drink, and then each of us will make the right choice or the right decision. So I think that, and I have seen there are 40 or so indices out there that relate to the vulnerability side of the equation that have been put together in the last 10 years. There is only one that actually incorporates the readiness part, which is the final note I wanted to make, which is it almost doesn't matter how capable we are of signaling or understanding the vulnerabilities to which we are exposed to. For me, the most important part is how do we go about minimizing the impact of those vulnerabilities on people's lives. And for that, you really need to enable the environment for investments to take place. You need to minimize corruption. You need to have better rules of the game. You need to have a little bit more predictability. You need to know what kind of return on investment you're going to have and the double bottom line that you are pursuing. And that's where the ND gain value comes in adding that readiness part, which, by the way, has a 0.97 correlation with most of the indicators that are commonly accepted by rating agencies and others. So again, it's not a perfect tool, and that was never the intention, but it is a good enough, informative enough tool that can make any board of directors of any public or privately owned company decide with better information where they can get a higher return on investment while also doing good for the communities where they are. And by the way, we did an experiment some time ago, and not surprisingly, most corporations we requested information from were interested more with those countries that are in the blue quadrant, namely those that have high vulnerabilities and a relatively high level of readiness. And one final comment, our colleague from Mexico, the Tecnológico de Monterrey, she's here. With Tecnológico de Monterrey, supported by the Templeton Foundation, we went one layer below country level and actually started to zoom in into the states. And we took small and medium-sized enterprises as the place where most of this data can be collected and comparable, because the challenge of going from country level to local level to state level, then to local level, which is where adaptation takes place, is the lack of data. And so there are means as to how to go about developing that. And that's one of the other challenges that we have ahead of us. And hopefully, as these conversations take place and it's no longer a scene to talk about adaptation, we will be able to produce that next level of granularity of information, which will make it even more informative and useful for people in the private sector. So that's a very long comment, but I think it was important to show, Jessica, the value and the easiness, the user-friendliness of the index itself.
And Ian referenced in his comments your passion and enthusiasm for this topic, and it was wonderful for you to stand up and demonstrate that. And do you have a comment or a question at the end of your comment for the panel? Or do you want to go have a drink? Okay. Well, all right. So Joyce asked me to invite everyone, please, over into the dining room to join us for refreshments and dinner, and where we're hopefully, and I'm certain we will, have a stimulating conversation from following a wonderful day of panels and discussion. So thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.
If you, I know Ian said that he had been involved in this, you guys thinking about adaptation indicators. We would love to chat with you about that from an academic.
So as Jessica mentioned, please do join us across the hall. And in addition to refreshments and food, we also have the pleasure of hearing from GE Ecomagination after we've had some time to discuss together. Thanks.